neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time. But there are patterns. Because one of the things that Robert Jordan does so brilliantly throughout the Wheel of Time is create this sense that stories are never truly new. They might wear different names, different faces, and appear in different ages. History becomes legend, legend becomes myth. And although many of those stories will eventually fall victim to the sands of time, fragments will always remain. Which makes trying to trace a single inspiration for anything in the Wheel of Time practically impossible. Jordan was weaving from everywhere: Norse mythology, Arthurian legend, Hindu cosmology, Abrahamic traditions, Persian epics, and even physics and cyclical theories on the nature of time. The Dark One alone feels less like a single mythological figure and more like a convergence point. There's a touch of Satan in there, even echoes of Apep, the Egyptian serpent of chaos who is constantly pressed up against creation, waiting for opportunity to end it. And we cannot ignore the parallels of Jormungandr, the world serpent tied to the apocalypse and the break-in of cosmic order. But more than anything, the Dark One feels like entropy itself. It's not evil in the simple fantasy sense, but more inevitable in its unraveling of structure. It's that very force that's quietly pulling creation back towards chaos. Which does feel very on brand for Robert Jordan, because he was a writer who was deeply interested in balance and polarity and the cycles that they go through. He especially paid close attention to the fragile tension that is holding existence together. And yet, among all possible influences that are woven into the pattern, there are certain stories that make me stop and think, okay, I see what you did there. So today I'm going to be exploring the Persian epic of Zahhak. Now, before the comment section assembles itself into a full sitting of the Brown Ajar, no, I'm not claiming that Zahhak is a direct representation of the Dark One. And I'm probably not claiming that Shayol Ghul is directly lifted from Persian mythology. I'm definitely not going to suggest that this is the only influence for Shayol Ghul and the imprisonment of the Dark One and the Forsaken, mainly because that's just not really how Robert Jordan wrote. The Wheel of Time is syncretic by nature. Jordan layered myth on top of myth until those stories became something entirely of their own. What interests me is resonance, those singular threads intertwining with one another until a form starts to appear. Because the parallels here get very interesting. In Persian mythology, Zahhak is an ancient tyrant who is associated with corruption, serpents of chaos, human sacrifice, and eventually imprisonment within an earthly mountain, where even today local legends state that his release will signal the end of time. But it gets stranger, because according to the myth, Zahhak foresaw his downfall at the hands of heroes who were not even born yet. Now, if that doesn't already make you go, hang on a second, what's even stranger is that in some versions of the myth, Zahhak foresaw 3 warriors who would be responsible for his downfall. And that just makes my neurospicy Wheel of Time obsessed brain want to explore this story far deeper. Because now we have this recurring mythical structure forming. 3 figures tied to fate, prophesied before they're even born, moving inevitably towards a confrontation with an evil force associated with the apocalypse. But wait, there is more. Because if this wasn't already convincing enough for you, it turns out that one of the warriors associated with his downfall is, of course, the blacksmith. Which is where mythology gets really interesting. Because in mythology, people are rarely just people. They become vessels for much larger forces. Kings will embody order, and serpents will embody transformation, whether through wisdom or chaos, often both. The wanderer will represent transition, and the mother will represent creation. Tricksters are usually associated with hidden knowledge and disruption. Myth takes enormously cosmological ideas and makes them human enough for us to experience emotionally. And Robert Jordan absolutely understood that structure, which is why Perrin is never just a man who works with a hammer. The blacksmith archetype matters, but that's probably a topic for another video. When you start stacking all of these elements together, an imprisoned evil, a mountainside prison, 3 figures prophesized, moving towards an inevitable showdown with blacksmith symbolism, you have to wonder whether somewhere in Robert Jordan's enormous web of mythological research that Zahhak was just one more story that was woven into the wheel. And that is really what this series is about. It's not about proving direct inspiration, but rather just tracing those threads through the pattern, looking at the myths and the symbolism and the archetypes that may have been woven, whether consciously or unconsciously, into the Wheel of Time. Because there are countless myths recounted and subtly referenced within these books. And this here, this is just another potential thread. So let's talk about the myth of Zahhak. So before I get into the story, there's a couple of important disclaimers that I do want to make here. This is probably going to apply to every video in the series. I appreciate that the intro for this one is a little bit on the longer side, but obviously we're setting things up here and it's important to kind of get this stuff out of the way. Mythology is messy, like really messy. I mean, it's why I love it so much, but oh God, it is so messy. And the second you try to take any story as a literal telling, you're really quickly going to start to unravel. So in Iranian mythology, Zahhak is essentially the personification of evil rather than like an individual figure. The moment you start to research him, you will very quickly realize that there isn't just one version of the story. There's many, and one of them isn't essentially more correct than the other because that's the nature of myth. These stories existed as oral traditions long before they were ever written down. And by the time someone finally decides to actually preserve them for future generations, you already have had centuries, sometimes even thousands of years of retellings, regional variations, political influence, religious reinterpretations, poetic embellishments, and of course, as with anything, you're going to have Dave from 800 BC who swears that his grandfather was actually there and therefore tells the story better. And then if we want to make things even more complicated, different writers preserve all of these stories at different ages of civilization. So essentially what that means is that the story is going to change depending on what that culture fears, it values, it worships, or is essentially just trying to teach. And with Zahhak, we're dealing with one of the oldest mythic traditions that exists on Earth today. This story reaches all the way back into ancient Persia, and ancient Persian roots stretch likely even further into Mesopotamian tradition, which is the earliest cradle of civilization. So you're trying to reconstruct one perfectly linear canon version of a myth, and unfortunately that's just going to be impossible. Sorry. But to me, I mean, honestly, that is very Wheel of Time. So as Wheel of Time fans, we should really understand and appreciate that in a lot of ways. You know, stories change as ages turn and truth becomes legend and legend becomes myth. And, you know, Robert Jordan, he really understood that process, and personally, you know, of an opinion that it likely inspired the way that he chose to write his stories. Now, with regards to this myth, the version that most people know or have heard comes from the Shahnameh, which is the Persian Book of Kings, and it was written by a poet called Fereydun around the 10th century. But Zahhak also appears in older Zoroastrian texts, particularly the Avesta, where he is referred to as Aziz, Dhaka, and later Zahhak. And this is where things can get potentially interesting for Wheel of Time fans, because in the older religious texts, Zahhak feels less like a tyrant king and more like a cosmic force of corruption. He's something very ancient and destructive, and as a being, he's just associated with chaos itself. Of course, that starts to feel very dark when coded. Now, for the sake of continuity, and also because my aggressively white British vocal cords are really trying their best here, I'm mostly going to use the name Zahhak because it's generally the name that's used when the story is retold in the epic and poetic traditions, rather than the strictly religious context. And personally, I prefer approaching myth this way, because once you actually detach myth from the need for literalism, you can start to read the archetypes that are underneath it. Those are the reoccurring patterns and the same cosmic ideas that appear again and again throughout different cultures and different ages. And that's exactly what Robert Jordan was doing in The Wheel of Time. So thanks for listening, and with all that said, let's now talk about Zahhak. Shahnameh, Zahhak does not begin as a cosmic horror who is patiently lurking beneath the mountain, waiting to trigger the apocalypse. He begins as a prince. And that already sounds like the kind of storytelling that Robert Jordan would have loved, because Jordan consistently understood that catastrophe generally begins in profoundly human ways. Pride and fear, ambition, and weakness are all the perfect elements for the slow compromise of a soul over time. What makes Zahhak especially fascinating, though, is that he exists in multiple forms depending on which tradition you're reading from. In the older Zoroastrian material, particularly the Avesta, Zahhak, or Aziz Zahhaka, feels almost entirely cosmic. Less man and more the embodiment of destructive evil. He is described as a monstrous being with 3 mouths, 6 eyes, and 3 heads, cunning, powerful, and demonic. Interestingly, as a side note, Aziz is the literal translation of serpent, also dragon. But interestingly, he is never portrayed as a mere beast. Even in these terrifying forms, he retains human qualities, which makes him feel less like an animal and more like corruption, wearing the shape of intelligence. Later Zoroastrian texts take this even further. In the Damāvand, where he is named Zahhak, he is described as possessing every possible sin and evil counsel imaginable. The name Zahhak is interpreted in this belief as having 10 sins. Now, something about this already feels very Jordan-esque, because Jordan really presents evil as mindless. The shadow is intelligent, it's seductive and philosophical. It understands humanity because it moves through humanity. And I think that's why Zahhak becomes such an interesting comparison point in relation to the Wheel of Time, because when we move back to the Shahnameh tradition, the myth shifts again. Zahhak is not born as evil itself, but he is seduced by it. He is corruptible. He's easily influenced, gradually drawn into darkness rather than fully emerging from it. And this is where the comparison between the structure of this mythology and the Wheel of Time becomes extremely interesting to me, because Jordan constantly fractured archetypes across multiple characters rather than locking them into a single figure. The Dark One is not Isharmel, and Isharmel is not the Dark One. But Isharmel becomes so consumed by the shadow, philosophically, psychologically, even spiritually, that many people within the world fail to distinguish between them anymore. And honestly, I think that blurring is intentional, because Isharmel occupies the philosopher archetype. The man is trying to intellectually reconcile humanity with cosmic force. He recognizes the wheel and the pattern and the endless repetition of suffering across the ages. And his conclusion is essentially, if the shadow permeates reality so completely, then perhaps the distinction between human evil and cosmic evil is itself an illusion. He never outright claims to be the Dark One, but he increasingly behaves as though he understands himself to be an extension of that force, a human vessel through which the principle of the Dark One expresses itself. And Zahhak feels very similar in that regard. It moves gradually through him, slowly and subtly at first, until eventually the line between man and the corruption inhabiting him becomes increasingly difficult to separate. And that's what makes the story unsettling. Not because Zahhak is some incomprehensible monster, but because the myth is constantly reminding us that was once, still is, a human being underneath it all. A prince, a son, ultimately a man who was capable of making a choice. The horror comes through erosion, and erosion is exactly the fracture that the Dark One seeps through in the Wheel of Time. The reason the Forsaken are so terrifying in the Wheel of Time is because many of them did not fall through simple cruelty. They fell through pride or ideology, despair or ambition, fear in a lot of cases, and sometimes just the belief that they alone understood some greater truth that others could not. Which is why myths and stories like this continue to resonate across the ages. They're never really about monsters, but about the frightening permeability between human weakness and cosmic destruction. And that is exactly where Zahhak's story begins. Zahhak is the son of a ruler named Murdars. He's a good and noble king. But eventually Zahhak, who is considered somewhat weak-minded, is approached by a dark figure, Ahriman. The destructive spirit in Zoroastrian cosmology is associated with deceit, corruption, chaos, and the breaking of divine order itself. And honestly, the more you read about Ahriman, the more you might start side-eyeing the Dark One just a little bit. Because Ahriman does not begin with open destruction. He whispers, he manipulates, he tempts. He finds the fracture already present within the person and he slowly widens it. Which, in my opinion, draws undeniable parallels to the shadow in the Wheel of Time. Because the Dark One rarely wins people through force first. It offers power, certainty, freedom from suffering, freedom from meaning. And that's exactly how Ahriman approaches Zahhak. He appears in disguise, and gradually he gains the young prince's trust, feeding his ambition little by little, until Zahhak murders his own father and seizes the throne. Now, what matters mythologically is that Zahhak is still not portrayed as pure evil, even at this point. He's still just weak and open and corruptible. And that distinction is incredibly important. As mentioned earlier, the terrifying thing is not always the monster. More often than not, the terrifying thing is the human being who is willing to invite the monster inside. And once Zahhak takes the throne, Reborn returns. This time, he's disguised as a cook, because apparently evil is fully committed to the longing and will pursue whatever career path is necessary. A chef, an accountant, a politician. And through indulgence, luxury, excess, temptation, Reborn slowly draws Zahhak further and further away from balance until finally, before departing, he asks for one small reward: to place a kiss upon each of the king's shoulders. Now, personally, as someone whose nervous system considers unexpected human contact as a mild act of war, I would have been suspicious at this point, but I'm told neurotypical people enjoy these things, so Zahhak agrees. And the moment Reborn kisses him, 2 black serpents erupt from Zahhak's shoulders. And this is where the myth shifts from political tragedy into a cosmic horror. Because the snakes cannot be killed. Many attempts are made to remove them, their heads cut off, but every time they grow back. And it's such an important symbolic detail because evil here is behaving less like a physical enemy and more like a cosmic principle. You cannot simply stab the snake and call it a day. And worse still, the serpents are trying to consume Zahhak himself, because corruption never truly serves its host forever. Eventually, it devours them too. So once again, Reborn appears, and this time he's disguised as a physician. And he explains that the snakes can never be removed. The only way to quiet them, the only way to stop them from consuming Zahhak entirely, is to feed them, specifically human brains. So every single day, Zahhak's soldiers will seize 2 men from the kingdom, execute them, and prepare their brains into a stew for the serpents. And as you can imagine, under Zahhak's rule, the world falls into terror. There's death and oppression. Everyone lives in fear and spiritual imbalance. The land itself begins to feel sick under his reign, which again starts sounding very Wheel of Time, because Jordan repeatedly presents evil not as simple destruction, but as corruption of the natural order itself. The pattern phrase, reality twists, the world becomes spiritually diseased beneath the influence of the shadow. And then prophecy enters the story, because Zahhak starts to dream. And his dreams are pretty terrifying, for him at least. After centuries of ruling the world, Zahhak dreams a vision of 3 warriors attacking him. And the youngest amongst them strikes Zahhak down with a great mace, binds him in chains, and drags him towards Mount Damāvand, with crowds gathering behind them. Now, Mount Damāvand is a real mountain, by the way. It's an enormous volcanic peak in northern Iran. It's the tallest mountain of the Middle East, and it looms over the landscape like a mythological figure itself. Zahhak awakens, screaming so violently that the pillars of his palace shake. He summons priests, scholars, astrologers, wise men, basically every expert available in the please explain my nightmare immediately industry. And eventually, one of them finally has the guts to tell him the truth. The dream is a prophecy. His reign will end at the hands of a young man named Fereydun. Now, this is where my brain starts aggressively itching, because before Fereydun is even grown, before he understands his own destiny, before he can possibly threaten this god-powered king, prophecy is already moving around him. Zahhak learns of his enemy before the boy even becomes a man. And this does feel astonishingly like the prophecy of the dragon being reborn. The pattern is already weaving itself towards an inevitable confrontation. And like Rand, Fereydun must be hidden away, protected in secret from the tyrant who is searching for him. After Zahhak murders Fereydun's father, the child is taken into hiding far from the centres of power, far from the king, far from civilization, and he's sheltered quietly in the wilderness. And in one of the most mythologically symbolic details in the description of Fereydun's upbringing is that Fereydun is nourished by a sacred cow. Now, listen, am I saying that this directly inspired Rand al'Thor being hidden away on a farm in the Two Rivers? No. Am I saying that the giant prophesied saviour raised in isolation, who later returns to confront cosmic evil, maybe feels a tiny bit familiar? Possibly. Because according to the historian Al-Tabari, Fereydun was apparently so enormous that he was described as 9 spear lengths tall, which honestly sounds less like a man and more like an ideal exaggeration after several rounds of Usquai. But I digress. The parallels are just becoming more difficult not to notice. The hidden child who's a prophesied saviour in a rural upbringing, a tyrant who's searching for him before he even understands who he is. The structure appears over and over again throughout mythology because it expresses something deeply human. Hope, emerging quietly at the edge of the world while power obsesses over itself at the centre. Now, eventually, Zahhak's tyranny becomes unbearable. And this is where we meet Kaveh. Kaveh is the blacksmith. And honestly, this man enters the story with Perrin Aybara energy. He's lost his family to Zahhak's brutality, and he's finally reached his limit. He publicly denounces the king. He refuses submission, and he incites rebellion amongst the people. And then, in one of the most symbolically important moments in the Persian myth, he raises his blacksmith's apron as a banner of revolt, which later becomes one of the great legendary standards of Persia itself. Even in modern Iranian history, Kaveh has repeatedly re-emerged as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And once again, we return to this mythic archetype that Jordan clearly understood. The blacksmith is never just a labourer. The smith stands between chaos and order. The smith transforms potential into reality. It shapes destiny through pressure and heat and endurance and restraint. Which is exactly why Perrin's identity as a smith matters so much symbolically in the Wheel of Time. And like Perrin, Carve becomes one of the forces helping restore balance to the broken world. Eventually, Fereydun rises against Zahhak and defeats him with the aid of a bull-headed mace. Interpret that as you will. But then comes the most important part in the story in comparison to the Wheel of Time. Fereydun, although set with the intention to kill Zahhak, realizes he cannot be killed. Not because he doesn't want to kill him, but because evil in this cosmology can never truly be destroyed. Not permanently. Because for order to exist, chaos must also exist. And tension between them is part of the structure of reality itself. So instead, Zahhak is bound in chains and imprisoned deep within Mount Damāvand, the volcanic mountain from his prophetic dream. Sealed beneath the mountain until the end of the age. And according to later tradition, he will break free again, bring in devastation with him when the world reaches its final unraveling. Now, whether these parallels are direct inspiration, unconscious influence, or simply ancient archetypes re-emerging through another turning of the wheel, it's very difficult not to see shades of Shayol here. An ancient force for corruption, bound beneath a mountain, not destroyed, only contained, waiting for the moment when the world grows weak enough for his prison to fail. And maybe that's ultimately why stories like this endure. Because across cultures, religions, and entire ages of human history, we keep returning to the same fear. The evil never truly disappears. It waits. It whispers. It sleeps beneath the mountain. And eventually, the wheel turns again. Now, interestingly, the myth of Zahhak never fully clarifies who the three warriors are. The youngest is clearly Fereydun, the prophesied figure who ultimately brings about Zahhak's downfall. But the other two remain strangely indistinct, although there's a fairly strong implication that one of them may in fact be the blacksmith. And honestly, that ambiguity is very true to the nature of myth, which tends to preserve symbolic imagery more clearly than exact detail. The structure is what survives, the emotion of the story, but specifics will shift and blur across centuries of retelling. And personally, I kind of like the idea that if there were a third figure analogous to Matt in this kind of structure, he would naturally become the hardest one to trace historically. Because Matt always existed on the edge of things. He was always slipping through structures and past authority. History generally has a hard time pinning down these types of characters and their roles within the greater story. Even within the Wheel of Time, Matt repeatedly becomes one of the most influential people in the world, while simultaneously feeling strangely detached from the grand mythologizing around him. In fact, often the things that he actively is responsible for, most people don't know that it was him. He's the rogue, the wanderer, the trickster who's moving through the pattern sideways rather than directly. So what interested me here was never the idea that these are secretly Rand, Mat and Perrin. That's not really the point. What caught my attention is the pattern itself. You have three figures who are tied to destiny. A tyrant who is learning of his downfall before the heroes are even fully emerged in the world. And you have a force of corruption that is associated with apocalyptic imagery and imprisonment beneath a mountain. And then there is this small detail that in some versions of the prophesied dream, the youngest warrior carries a bull-headed mace. Now, that may mean absolutely nothing, but in a series where Perrin is known as Young Bull in the dream world of Talan Ariod and is symbolically tied to the hammer, well, it's at least an interesting image to sit with. And I think that's ultimately the most fascinating part of exploring mythology in relation to the Wheel of Time or any fantasy series, because it's not about proving a direct inspiration. I certainly have no interest in reducing Jordan's work to a checklist of references, but rather is about noticing how certain archetypes, symbols, and story structures seem to echo across cultures and ages. And it's almost as if the stories themselves evolve in the way myths always have. They're reshaped and retold. They're rewoven into new patterns over time. And whether that resonance feels meaningful or purely coincidental, I'll leave that for you to decide.